Chapter 14. After the same journey in reverse to get back to Margincourt, Drew went straight to her shower. Lala was waiting for her when she came back into her rooms. "Supper will be ready soon," Lala said. "Will you be taking it here or with your father?" "I'll be across the hall. Why don't you put my supper with Penny's?" Drew asked, drying her hair with a fluffy white towel. "Very well, ma'am," Lala said, bowing, stepping out of the room, pulling the door closed behind her. Drew got dressed and went across the hall, knocking on Penny's door before unlocking it and going inside. "Just wait until I tell you what we did today," Drew said, pulling the door closed behind her. Penny was sitting on his cot, reading a physics textbook she brought him from the library. "I want to hear all about it," he said. Drew sat at Penny's desk and related the adventure, and Penny listened, sometimes stopping her to ask questions, but mostly just nodding and smiling. "So you didn't have to use your hands or anything to use your power?" he asked. "No, I never did really. It was just a crutch." "Interesting," Penny said. "Did you talk to your father about me?" "I brought it up, but we didn't have a lot of time to talk about it," Drew said. "What do you think he'll do?" Drew sighed. "Penny, you killed 5 people with your power. I know you learned a lot more about how to control it, but you have to know that in a lot of places you would have been dead a long time by now." "I know," Penny said. "I'm sorry. I appreciate being alive. Maybe one day he'll change his mind about me." "It's really the only choice you have," Drew said. "Can we at least get out of these rooms?" Penny asked. "I'd love to go outside. Maybe this place has a roof we can go out on, feel the breeze from the ocean." "I think we can do that much," Drew said. There was a knock and she opened the door. Lala was there, holding a folding table with their meals. "Thank you, Lala," Drew said, careful to keep herself between the Inkling and Penny. "Yes, ma'am," Lala said, bowing slightly from her waist after Drew took the tray away from her. She waited for Lala to move away before coming back inside and closing the door. "Let's eat, and then we'll see what we can find at the top of this place." "Sounds like a plan to me," Penny said. Drew thought that if they simply went up a stairwell as far as they could, they'd end up on the roof. Penny agreed. As soon as they were done eating, she left the table with the dirty dishes in the corridor for Lala to pick up and led Penny to the stairwell at the end of their corridor. "I can't believe you've never done this before," Penny asked as they began to climb. "I've been so busy studying and training," Drew said. She let Penny get a few steps ahead of her so she could see him better in the dimness of the stairwell. "At least you get to go outside when he takes you somewhere," Penny said. "You aren't stuck inside all the time." "Yeah, I'm sorry about that," Drew said. They walked for what seemed like a long time, and Drew wondered just how big Margincourt was. It looked like it went on forever. Eventually, though, they reached the last landing. "I guess this is it," Drew said, standing at the door. Penny stood there, panting with the effort of the climb as she tried the door. She hoped it wasn't locked, as she didn't have a key and didn't want to make the long trip back down until she'd had a chance to catch her breath. To her relief, the door opened and sunlight came in. "Wow," Penny said, stepping through the door. Drew followed. They were, indeed, on the roof. There was a low wall around the edges of the flat roof, with small holes in it every few feet. The sunlight was a lot yellower than she usually saw. There was a slight breeze, and she could smell the salty tang of the ocean. Penny ran to the edge and looked out over the landscape, and Drew joined him. They were high in the air. Drew got a little dizzy looking down. They were in the midst of a mountain range. A river passed close by, flowing a twisting course to the ocean. Near where the ocean had to be, she saw what looked like a village with small houses, some with smoke coming from chimneys. The sun was behind her, heading towards dusk, and there were a few clouds. Then, in the distance, she saw what had to be one of the dragons her father told her about, a long shape, nothing but a shadow against the yellow sky, winged and flying further out over the ocean. Drew tried to use her power to sense the creature to see what sort of thing it could be, but it was either too far away or so foreign that she got nothing from it. "This is nice," Penny said, turning and smiling at her. "Thank you for letting me come up here." "Yes, it is nice," Drew said. "We'll come up here more often. Maybe have a picnic or something." There was plenty of nice flat roof or something like that, Penny thought, though the walk up to it might be a bit tiring, especially carrying food and drinks. "Good idea," Penny said. There was the sound of a gentle throat clearing, and she turned to see her father standing behind her. He was still dressed to go out, with his hat and umbrella and antique suit. "I'm sorry to interrupt your outing, Drew, but take Penny back to his rooms. Then come see me. We have a meeting." "What's going on?" she asked. "I don't know yet, but we'll probably be going out again much sooner than we expected." "I'm sorry," Drew said when she and Penny got back to his rooms. "It's not your fault," Penny said as she unlocked his door. "Thank you for taking me to the roof." "Thank you for asking me to take you. We'll do that picnic soon." She opened the door. "Good," Penny said, stepping into the room, Drew closing the door behind him. He heard her lock it again. He turned and leaned against the door, his right cheek pressing against the cool wood, and he felt more than heard Drew walk away. He could sense her just like he could the Briggs family or anybody else. He didn't think Drew or her father knew that he could do that, and they had never asked. For which he was grateful. If they didn't ask, he wouldn't have to lie. He closed his eyes, reaching out a little further as Drew walked away, pausing at the place where she'd always paused. Penny suspected that was the door to her father's room. Penny suspected he wouldn't be able to lie to Drew. He found that strange. He'd never had problems lying before, and he felt he could lie to her father with no problem. Somehow, though, Drew would know if he lied to her, because Drew was his friend. Penny thought about that, resting against the door. Penny had never had a friend before. There were one or two people who might have become friends if he'd been allowed to remain in one place for a little longer, but none he felt comfortable calling friend. He'd known Drew for a couple of years now, though. He didn't want to cause her any harm or trouble. He didn't want her mad at him. It was a strange feeling, Penny thought. He wasn't entirely sure he liked it. He could sense Mr. Winston, Drew's father, opening his door and letting her inside his room. There was someone else in the room, a human, Penny felt. Penny knew Drew's father, and Drew herself had this ability to use their power to find people, even particular people. It was how Mr. Winston had found them on the roof. He was sure that they used that ability to make sure he lived up to his promise and stayed in his rooms. So he needed to wait until they were gone before he could do what he was planning to do. The trip on the roof, breathing the fresh air, seeing the dragon in the distance had stirred something in Penny, a desire to regain his freedom. He had an idea for that too, but he needed Drew and Mr. Winston to be gone before he tried it. If they knew what he was planning to do, they'd try to stop him. Maybe Drew wouldn't kill him, but he knew Mr. Winston would, without even thinking about it. And he wasn't certain about Drew either. She was loyal to her father and would at least consider doing it if she felt she needed to. Waiting until they were gone for a while would be best, he thought. So he stood at the door quietly and watched, hoping the impressions of Drew and her father would soon wink out of existence and Penny could work on his little experiment. There was a young man in Drew's father's room. It took a moment for Drew to recognize him as Gerald. "Hi," she said, and he looked at her a little confused and realized he probably didn't know what hi meant. He seemed to figure it out, though. He nodded. "Greetings, young miss," he said. I didn't recognize you without your armor, Drew added. Her father had returned to his chair, settling, taking out a pipe. The bowl flared to life as he put the stem between his teeth, his power lighting the tobacco, and Drew could smell it as he puffed on it. Gerald's father is one of my advisors. His family has some power. Gerald himself brings us some interesting news. Okay, Drew said. She settled into the chair next to her father, and Gerald remained standing, and Drew could sense he was nervous. She could feel a bit of the power in him, too. He was not nearly as strong as she was, but he did have it a little. It's about my father, Gerald said. He fidgeted a bit, scratching his cheek with an index finger before continuing. He isn't himself. What do you mean? Drew asked. Has he been acting strangely? Oh, no, nothing like that. He's just not himself. It's as if someone has replaced him with someone who looks, sounds, and acts just like him, but isn't him. If it looks, acts, and sounds just like him, how do you know it's not him? Drew asked. Gerald blushed. I can't explain it, ma'am, he said. I just know. What do you think? Drew's father asked from his position in his chair. He exhaled plumes of pipe smoke. It sounds crazy, Drew said. But Gerald has the power. Could he be picking up something that happened to his father? Something hidden from everyone else? That's what I was thinking, her father said. Perhaps he's catching a whiff of something malevolent at work. That leads to another idea, too, that if, as you say, your father has been, shall we say, duplicated, that it's only a matter of time before whatever did it to him does it to you, Gerald. Gerald's eyes widened a bit at that, as if it hadn't occurred to him. What should I do? He asked. Lala, Drew's father called. After a few seconds, there was a gentle knock, and the Inkling came into the room. You summoned me, sir? She asked. Please take Gerald to the kitchen and make sure he eats something. Yes, sir, Lala said, glancing at Gerald, who seemed to relax a bit now that the interview was over. Thank you, sir, he said as he followed Lala out of the room. Lala pulled the door closed behind them, and Drew's father turned to face her, taking a deep draw from his pipe and exhaling the streams of smoke through his nose. What do you think? He asked her. Why do you care about this? Drew asked. It's only two people. Are you saying I shouldn't? He asked, cocking an eyebrow at her. No, but it's only two people. I thought we only worried about threats to all of humanity. True, but Drew's father, Richard, is a trusted advisor to me. This is well known. If something has happened to him, if he has been replaced by some sort of doppelganger, then there's a reason for it, and that reason has to be to infiltrate my inner circle. This would be a direct threat to me and to you too. Wouldn't whoever did this know that you could tell, even if it was a perfect duplicate? Drew asked. The after effects probably fade within a short time, so that even we wouldn't notice. Whoever did this may not be aware that Gerald himself possesses the power and can sense this sort of thing. Then there's something else too, Drew said. Something that you haven't said anything about. That Gerald may be crazy? I have thought of that. If that is the case, that would also need to be resolved. He works in this place and he has access to both of us. One way or another, I believe we will need to investigate this. Okay, Drew said. She didn't know what to hope for. That Gerald was right in something that happened to his father, or that Gerald himself was going insane. Chapter 15. They didn't take the Walk of the Worlds to get to the place where Gerald lived. Instead, her father led her down a flight of stairs and then into a courtyard. Drew could smell something when she came into the open air, something that was both pleasant and unpleasant at the same time. How are we going to get there? She asked her father. Carriage, he said, leading her towards a low building tucked away in one corner of the yard. It was the source of the smell, and when they went inside, she knew what caused it. There were horses in there, being tended by boys about Drew's age, she thought. There were cot and pillows and blankets there, and Drew guessed at least some of them lived there. There was a carriage with 2 horses hooked up already, and her father climbed aboard, patting the seat next to him. "Come, Drew," he said. "Cool," Drew said, climbing up into the seat next to him. She'd never ridden in a horse-drawn carriage before. He took the reins and snapped them, and the horses going through the door into the courtyard. They followed a narrow road until they left Margincourt through a gate Drew's father called a portcullis that had been raised, and over a drawbridge that crossed a deep moat that surrounded the whole building. Gerald didn't accompany them. He would ordinarily be on duty, her father said, and if something were going on, having him not go to work would arouse suspicions. Drew thought it was more likely he just didn't want Gerald around. "Gerald lives in the village?" she asked. "Yes. His father is the mayor. The human mayor, that is." "What other mayor would they have?" "There's an inkling mayor as well." "Oh," Drew said. They listened to the clopping of the horse hooves for a long while before she spoke again. "Can't we get a car?" "We could, but it may be a problem keeping it fueled. You don't like horses?" "I don't know. I've never been around them before," Drew said. "I'll have my stable master show you how to ride. It may come in handy." "That would be fun," Drew said, looking at him and smiling. "What do you think we're going to find?" "I'd rather not speculate. That could lead to invalid assumptions, which could lead to one or both of us getting killed." Penny was a bit disappointed that Drew and her father didn't leave via the Walk of Worlds that he knew started in Mr. Winston's rooms. That would mean they would be far away, too far to check on him. Instead, they climbed down the staircase and left some other way. He felt them gradually fading from his senses, and he had no idea if they could still sense him or not. He guessed that Drew, and especially her father, could do that sort of thing from much further away than he could. He gave it a few more minutes, once he thought he could no longer feel them, before deciding to take a chance and attempt the experiment he thought of earlier. He went to his closet and touched the door without opening it, resting his fingertips. He closed his eyes and tried to concentrate. He stood there for what felt like hours, he thought, but there were actually probably no more than a few minutes before he opened the door. All he saw was his clothes and a few other things that he kept there. He sighed and closed the door, resting his fingertips against it again, closing his eyes, concentrating, remembering what he'd learned from reading the physics book Drew brought him and from what he'd understood of his power. What he was considering would work. There was no reason that he could think of that it wouldn't. He kept whispering it over and over to himself. This will work. He could feel his power working, doing something. He felt a thin sheen of sweat covering his whole body. Finally, he opened the door again. Instead of his clothes, he saw a silvery path leading away into darkness between stars and planets. Penny had created another, personal Walk of Worlds. He stood there a moment, reaching out, seeing if he could sense Drew or her father. They were still too far away, he hoped, to notice what he'd done. He stepped over the threshold then, taking the first few steps on the newly created path. With a little effort, he could now walk to any place he could imagine. He could leave Margincourt entirely and go anywhere. He stood there, just on the path, thinking about where he wanted to go, when he sensed he was not alone. Someone was approaching along the newly created path. With the stars and the planets were bright enough they didn't illuminate the path very well, so he could just make out the form of someone, and he wondered what sort of creature would live in this place that didn't even exist until moments ago. Power. He could sense that the person coming towards him, and it was a person, he thought, a human, radiated power. More, even, than Mr. Winston himself. He didn't know how a human being could contain that much power and survive. "Stop," Penny said, wondering if he could just back through the door and close it, and if that would stop this person, if he or she was really looking to harm him. The figure, still several yards away, stopped, and he could feel it regarding him. "Who are you?" Penny asked, his voice sounding a lot louder than he intended. "A friend." It was a man's voice, but distorted, Penny thought. He could see, in the dim light, that it was very tall and wearing heavy robes, the cowl pulled up over the head to hide the face. It looked like there were leather gloves on the hands. "How did you get here?" Penny asked. "I have been waiting for you to make this place. I knew you would." "How can you know so much about me?" Penny asked. The figure stood there shaking as he finally realized it was laughing. "Oh, I know you better than anyone, Penny. I want to help you." "Help me how?" "I can provide guidance. I know what you want, even though you don't." "What do I want?" "Power. More than you have now. Knowledge and how to use it." "Really?" Penny said. "How should I trust you?" "You shouldn't." "Then what do you get out of helping me?" Penny asked. "I'll also be helping myself." "How? And who are you?" "Let's let that remain a mystery for now. My identity is irrelevant in any case." "What should I do then?" "You have taken the first stage towards fulfilling your destiny. You have learned the first lessons. There are many more. When you learn something new, think of the implications, what it means. Think of the consequences. If this is true, then it should mean that. Put the pieces together. Learn. Read. Become a sponge for knowledge." "You're saying I should stay here?" "No. It is dangerous for you at Margincourt now. You must leave." "I would be betraying Drew. I don't want to hurt her." "Of course you don't. But she will hurt you if she feels she must. Don't forget that. They keep things from you because they would help you to advance, to see you use your own power more effectively. You need to figure out how many things on your own, but that is something you can do." "You said I'd learn how to become more powerful. I've been told that isn't possible." "That is something you will learn for yourself." "But if I stayed here, I could learn much more. There are books, and Drew is teaching me." "She has been forbidden from teaching you what you would need to know most." "What would that be?" Penny asked. "How to grow in your power, how to survive. There is much she could teach you, but she will not because her father does not wish it." "Are you going to help me, guide me?" "I've given you all the guidance you require." "Then I'll stay. I won't betray Drew. I can leave any time I want now." "You will need to wait for them both to leave before using this ability you have discovered. That may not happen again for quite some time. You must seize your chance now." "I've already said I won't betray Drew. If I leave, he'll punish her. He'll think it's her fault. I can't have that." I was afraid that would be your decision. It's a mistake. You must leave now." "I won't," Penny said. The figure sighed. "So it comes to this, as I feared. Very well. Now I must leave." "What do you mean? Are you going to do something? Will I see you again?" "Yes, you will." The figure seemed to change shape slightly and faded like smoke in a breeze. After an hour, the carriage ride went from fun to boring, Drew thought. The seat was hard, the clopping of the horses' hooves monotonous, and she kept slipping off to sleep. "If we had a car, we would have been there a long time ago," she said. "If we had a car, it would take too much of our power to keep it fueled and working," her father said. Drew had nothing to say to that. She spent the time watching the scenery crawl by. The road passed through mountains, its path carefully chosen to make it level, she thought, knowing that that made it have a lot more curves. It was a nice day, though, a little hotter than she would have preferred. She turned back but could not see Margincourt itself. They had gone around a curve, and now there was a mountain between her and her home. Drew could smell smoke and then cooking odors like bacon, making her realize that she was hungry again. They rounded another curve and she could see the village laid out before them with its low, simple buildings and smoking chimneys. The river passed close by the other side of the village, and she could see where it flowed into the ocean not far away. She hoped for another glimpse of a dragon, but couldn't see any. People and Inklings both bustled about the village. There were fields on the outskirts where people were working, planting crops or weeding, she thought. Sheep and cows were grazing in another field, the animals idly watching them. People who saw them paused in what they were doing and bowed towards them as they passed. Drew could sense curiosity mixed with fear in them. "They're wondering why we're here," Drew whispered. "You must not come here often." "No, it is unusual," he said, flicking the reins, guiding the carriage down one of the cobblestone streets. He tugged the reins in front of a house that was a bit larger than the others, with 3 floors and a large yard. The horses stopped and a boy, just a little older than Drew, she thought, came out of a building nearby. "Take care of your horses, sir?" the boy asked. "Please," Drew's father said, climbing down from the carriage and then helping her to do the same. The boy led the horses and the carriage away, and Drew stretched, glad to finally not have to sit on that hard seat. "What are we going to do?" she whispered as they walked towards the front door. "Observe, investigate, until we know more, that is all." "They're going to ask why we're here," Drew said. "Let me handle it." They walked up the steps and he pulled on a rope that hung from an awning over the door. Drew heard the faint sound of a small bell. After a moment, the door opened and a woman looked at them both. She was an older lady, her hair done up in a bun, and she looked like she'd been busy cleaning, Drew thought. "Oh, my goodness, master, what brings you here?" She looked nervous and wouldn't meet his or Drew's eyes. Drew's father removed his hat and bowed slightly. "May I see Richard? Is he here?" "Indeed he is, though he's in the study and asked not to be disturbed," the woman said. "I'm sure he won't mind if we interrupt," he said, walking past her into the house. Drew followed, glancing around the place as her father led her into a staircase. She guessed this Richard person was an important person in the community, judging by how nice his furniture was. The boy at the top of the stairs, waiting for them to finish coming up so he could go down, Drew thought. He was a little older than she was, and he looked a lot like Gerald. She guessed this was his younger brother. "Hello, James," Drew's father said, and the boy smiled sheepishly before bowing slightly. "Hello, sir," he said. He looked at Drew and his face turned a bright red. "Are you here to see Father?" "Yes." "He's in the study. Do you know where that is?" "I can find it," Drew's father said. James nodded and slipped past them, going down the stairs quickly. Drew had used her power to try to find anything about James that was unusual or didn't belong, but she found nothing. She glanced at her father, who, she knew, had done the same thing. "He seemed normal enough," he muttered. "You got nothing from him?" "Nothing," Drew said. "It may be that whatever it is Gerald sensed has had time to cover its tracks. Or it may be that Gerald was simply imagining things," he said. He paused at a closed door and rapped it with his knuckle. "Come," said a man's voice from inside. He opened the door and held it for Drew, letting her go first before coming in himself and closing the door. The room was a little larger than Drew thought it would be. There were books on shelves that went to the high ceiling. Scrolls, pens, inkwells, papers, all were scattered around the place. Drew wanted to go through it all, organizing it. There was a desk near the back wall. It was a big desk, heavy-looking, like the man who sat behind it. Richard was an old man, Drew thought, tired and a bit afraid, she sensed, as they came towards him, and he turned his watery eyes towards them. "Well, well," Richard said, "what brings you out to see me?" He stood and bowed slightly, but not quite as much as the others, Drew thought. "Mainly I wanted you to meet my daughter, Drew," he said, and she felt his hand on her shoulder. Richard sat back down and looked at her for a moment. So, this is she, Richard said. Pleased to finally meet you. Nice to meet you too, Drew said. Something else brings you here, Mr. Winston. Please tell me, Richard said, gesturing at the chairs arranged in front of the desk for visitors, and Drew guessed that the people who lived in the village probably came here to consult with Richard when they had problems or disputes. She could sense that Richard had power, more than Gerald, he thought, but not nearly as much as hers. Her father settled in one of the chairs, and Drew sat in another next to him. It was much more comfortable than the carriage seat. I was wondering if you'd made any progress in discovering the source of the issues we're having with some of the Inklings, her father said. I haven't discovered it yet, Richard said. I've questioned several, but none of them claim to know anything. I'm inclined to believe them. Someone knows something, he said. I'm aware. I just haven't questioned the right one yet. I will, though. Perhaps you should broaden your inquiry to include humans. That's nonsense. You're our defender. Why would humans want to harm you? Humans that are in league with humanity's enemies, who suspect that there is something to be gained by eliminating me. I guess that's possible, but I think unlikely, Richard said. Do you have any definite suspects in mind? Perhaps I do, Drew's father said. He smiled slightly. Do you, perhaps, suspect me? Richard asked. Of course not. Don't be ridiculous. He smiled as he said it, and Richard looked at him a moment before nodding. What do you want me to do? Do you have any suggestions? Anybody who could be behind this? You know the people in this area much better than me. None come to mind. Well, think it over. Maybe someone has done something odd that may indicate guilt, something that may not be immediately apparent. We'll remain at the inn in the village for tonight. I want to look around. If I think of anything, I will find you and let you know, Richard said. Drew's father stood up, putting on his hat, and Drew got up too. It was good to meet you, Drew said to Richard. He looked at her, and no expression on his face at all. Likewise, he said as they left the room. Her father didn't speak again until they were outside. Gerald's right, he muttered, so that only Drew could hear. Drew waited until they'd gone to the inn, a short distance away from Richard's house, and had gotten a room and were inspecting it before she asked her father, How do you know? The room was not large, with 2 small beds, a table, and a couple of chairs, and a desk with another chair. Drew could see Richard's house through the window, along with the occasional carriage and passers-by on the streets. I lied to him, he said, leaning on the windowsill and staring at Richard's house. That's what he can use his power for? He can sense lies? That's it. That's one reason I asked him to head his investigation into the Inklings. What was the lie? He looked at her and smiled with one side of his mouth. I told him that I don't suspect him. He believed me. Oh, Drew said, what do we do now? This. He dug around in his pockets before he found a wadded up piece of cloth. It was dirty, marked with dark smudges, and Drew saw that it was wrapped around a small charcoal pencil. He glanced around the room and seemed to decide on a spot on the wall directly across from the window. He went to work drawing there, sketching what looked like a face, and Drew could tell his power was working as he did so. After a few minutes, he stepped back, looking over his work. It was a reasonable-looking sketch of his own face, she thought. What is that? Drew asked. Everyone knows we're in town by now. Finding where we are staying will be no effort at all. This is an alarm of a sort. Surveillance. Someone entering this room while we are out will set it off and alert me. I'll be able to see and hear what is happening in this room. Really? Cool, Drew said. There are 2 disadvantages to this, he went on. One is, once it's activated, whoever activated it will be able to see me as well. The other, it takes power to keep active. Not much, mind you, but enough to make it impractical to have have more than one or two active at once. The lines he'd drawn were fading already, and as she watched, they disappeared entirely. Someone will certainly approach us, perhaps with an eye towards doing us harm, or at least to spy on us. This will reveal who it is. Do you understand how I did this? I think so, Drew said. Watching him do it was an education to her, and she couldn't wait to get back to Margincourt to practice. What do we do now? The food here is very good, and I'm hungry. Let's get something to eat. Good idea, Drew said. Hello, this is J. Franklin Evans. Thank you for listening to this episode of Stories That Suck. Did it suck? Let me know. Be sure to like and subscribe.